So we want to talk about this performance paradox specifically, and there'll be more sort of visuals about this in a moment. But generally, this sort of overarching idea here is that there's maybe two ways to look at it. Way one is that one of the biggest challenges with performance is everybody's trying to solve their own piece, right? And so that even happened to us with the Builder platform. You know, we're extremely big on the content that's made through our visual editor being just brutally high performance. And one of the things people started finding is, okay, I integrated you on my site got faster, but there's still room for it to be faster. Our original point of view was, well, that's kind of not our doing. If we didn't cause the problem, you know, it's your problem, not ours. It's the technology, it's a third-party scripts, it's the way your React code is over, you know, loading, over hydrating. And we noticed that everybody else was kind of doing that too. Oh, no, it's their fault, it's their fault, it's their fault. And that really has not been helpful, right? It seems like almost nobody is willing to actually take the torch and say, you know, how do you actually properly make a website where you understand that businesses have needs, right? Like there are people who will tweet about, you get one or the other, you get performance or you get functionality, you have to choose. And I mean, we hate that answer. That is just a terrible cop-out answer, and in our opinion. Yet it actually truly has been the truth to date. You know, there's actually a ton of truth to it. And so it's not necessarily a wrong assessment. The problem though, is because we've kind of always seen this as a linear thing, businesses always sort of drift along this line. They'll like do this huge project to like optimize performance, and they'll squeeze everything they can. But then the marketing team needs to generate new content at a faster rate or run A/B tests or do personalization. The application needs additional functionality and features. And essentially you slip back into that mode that maybe you did this whole project to fix from. So the question is, how do we actually properly solve performance? How do we like acknowledge at the front, we're gonna need third-party scripts. We're gonna need functionality. We're going to need features. Like the solution is not to tell your marketing team not to market. And the solution is not to just say like, I'm going to build an app, but it'll have no functionality, right? If you're at a reasonable sized business, so these are not options. So let's stop kidding ourselves and acting like they are. And let's stop pointing fingers and say, no, well, if you didn't have that, you know, things would be fixed. But the first question I think we want to answer that we have some interesting data on before we go into sort of how to solve it is, what is the root problem here? Like we've done some really interesting research. As one last bit of context, we've done a lot of research on like what is actually making websites slow. It's not just because the Builder platform has a bunch of customers across tons of business sizes and technology stacks who all really want good performance. It's why they choose the platform over some other options. But it's not only that, it's actually the fact that, you know, we really need to make sure that we understand sort of what is causing the root issues and make sure that we can actually solve them sort of at their core. And in the case of Builder, we have this interesting setup where we can output code to any framework. And so we started doing lots of research on like, well, how can we output code in different ways? And yes, there is a recording. So we can share that. I think social media, this and that, or I think if you sign up properly in the Zoom webinar, I think you should have it, but we will have a recording of this. But anyway, we really want to look at the root causes, and with Builder, we can generate the same exact content, the same page for a wide variety of technology stacks, and we can tweak how we generate images. We can tweak, you know, how the JavaScript is loaded, and that actually gave us this really interesting test bed to see like what is actually causing performance to be hard. Like we generated our own homepage 1,000 million times with 1,000 million frameworks, and we really struggled to get a real live page, no matter how you even hard code, you know, various things to be better than like a 60 out of 100 on Google PageSpeed Insights. So we realized in this trial and error, we started learning some stuff and we turned it into a tool. So to get to actual first bit of content, we started making this tool. We call it Performance Insights. You can go to it if you want to try yourself. It's like builder.io/c/performance insights. And so this was just a very simple tool to say, okay, at the end of the day, you know, your website produces some code, HTML, CSS, JavaScript, images, etc. And so what would happen if we actually put a layer in front of that at the edge? We basically ingested your website and we ran modifications to the code, and then we measure the performance on the results. The idea here being, you know, Lighthouse will suggest 1,001 things for how you can improve your performance. If you've been in a position like me, you may have observed that it can be extremely time consuming to test all these things, and you don't even know if they'll improve your performance. Like Lighthouse will say, don't use document.write. You're like, okay, maybe it's a third-party script that's doing that, so it's pretty hard to modify. I'm not going to start regexing Google Analytics.js. Or maybe it's something so deep in the code, it's going to be a very challenging thing to update. It'd be really nice to know ahead of time, like, is what's actually going to have an impact. And so we're like, okay, let's take the big buckets of things Lighthouse recommends. Let's have something run those on the output code of your site and then test the performance and see what happens. And what we found is there's really three big buckets that made a big difference. You need to make sure your images are optimized. So lazy loaded, next-gen formats, stuff like that. The website above is just for testing on a real world website. Actually, I'll finish the explanation. This is sort of the explanation of that. But it's for testing. This is a question for the chat. It's for testing sort of like what types of optimizations will actually make a difference on your performance score of your site. So you can know where should you focus and what can you invest your time into where you actually see results. At the end of the day, we all want to have a green website, a website that's 90 or above on Google PageSpeed Insights. And again, we like Google PageSpeed Insights. It's a brutal metric. Like most sites don't pass. We have some accurate data on that. But it's realistic. It actually uses emulated real-world imperfect devices and emulated real-world imperfect networks. So it's not, I think we all probably know in here that running Lighthouse on your M1 MacBook on your gigabit fiber Ethernet is not, it's not very indicative of real-world conditions that most people in the world who are on their, middle market Android phone on a bus with poor reception, right? But your website, if you're selling a product, subscriptions, whatever the point of your website is, it should function. If they don't, your business suffers. And there's other data we can show about how actually impactful performance is, like how it actually increases balance, reduces time on site, it lowers sales and conversions, like anything you care about, any goal of your website goes down when your performance is down. So there's a strong business case here. And so if any of your engineers are like, hey, I need to convince the higher ups to do this project, I hope some of what we have here, even on this site, will give you some of that ammo to say, yes, performance makes a difference. And to have confidence say, yes, the approaches we suggest here can have a serious impact. But back to the tool, basically we found if you optimize images, CSS, and reduce JavaScript, any website can get to 95 plus out of 100 on Google's sort of pretty rigorous testing, their mobile PageSpeed Insights. And that's kind of a pretty important revelation, right? Because on average, you don't get that score. And so what this tool will do is it'll just check, okay, what's the current score? So we're using Priceline.com, we have some friends there. And so 35, that's actually a pretty good score, to be honest. For like a large scale website, that is a surprisingly good score. I've seen 1s and 2s and 3s all over the place. So 35 is pretty good. What you see here is when we optimize images, the score doesn't improve. It means Priceline did a good job optimizing images. There's no obvious additional optimizations to run. CSS is the same thing. To optimize CSS, we mostly just reduce unused styles, make sure we load fonts in a smart way, stuff like that. And again, you see when we run those optimizations and then retest the performance, no improvement. So you're like, okay, Priceline's doing great on image optimization and CSS. The last bucket, the bucket here, you'll see is JavaScript. Now, all this test does is just deletes it. So obviously we know that's not a very real world test, but we'll get to why actually it's maybe more real world than you might realize. But if you just eliminate all the JavaScript on Priceline.com and do literally nothing else, your time to interactive goes from 25 seconds to 2, and your Lighthouse score goes from 35 to 96. Like, it's crazy. And if you're like, okay, this is cool, but that's one website, maybe not reflective of my website, we ran a bunch of aggregate data here as well. Specifically, what we did is we took the top 50 e-commerce websites. We specifically chose e-commerce because e-commerce really cares about performance. Like, performance directly impacts the bottom line. Saving seconds increases dollars tremendously. There's so many studies on there. Amazon found like millions of dollars in saving from increasing performance. So that's one thing. The next thing is e-commerce is usually a non-trivial website. Like, it might look trivial, but they need things like A/B testing, personalization. They need these nice advanced slide-in carts and these sort of advanced product pickers. Like, they need performance, and you can actually see here they're struggling to get it. The average Lighthouse score of these websites is 23. The average time to interactive is 26. That's insane. I want to make sure we're clear about that. On a normal mobile device, on a normal network, it takes almost 30 seconds for the thing to actually be usable, to actually click on stuff. That is so abysmal. And so what you can see here that's pretty straightforward is optimizing images in CSS might save you a bit, but it's reducing the amount of JavaScript to get to the interactive state that makes a huge difference. Just doing that alone shoots up the score on average, not just like the Priceline example, but across the board. And it also decreases the TTI insanely, like 90% reduction, which is honestly huge. And so, of course, you're probably like, okay, well, how do we achieve that? We can't have a website with no JavaScript. We can't just have a static page with links only. And we agree with that. And so kind of moving forward, this is what we're going to do a quick overview on. Now, we'll do follow-up sessions to go deeper on each topic. but I want to make sure I cover like the three things. This is what we found personally in our experience and experiences out there in the ecosystem, that if you don't solve all three buckets, you kind of can get ripped back into that paradox of something new is needed and performance gets hurt again. And so, oh, cool, we got some questions coming in. We'll get to those in a second, but please keep adding those. So I'll cover this and then take a look at that question. So the first piece is we have this project called Qwik, and we'll go into the detail. But basically the short answer is if we want to reduce the amount of JavaScript that is loaded in the browser from code that you wrote, your team is creating all these components. And in a typical, say, React app, you are going to suffer performance. The more components you add, even if you do, and we've talked to people who have gone super deep on trying to do all kinds of like suspense and lazy and all this stuff, it still only gets you so far. Because of the mental model, the hydration model really has this fundamental challenge of the requirement to eager load virtually everything that might be needed on a page. And that's where Qwik is a solution. We'll go into that. But with that, you really truly, like if your website had insane functionality and only first party code, only code you wrote, you can get any website to 100 out of 100 just with Qwik alone. But then reality number two sets in. Reality number two is you're going to need third-party scripts. Like, I'm sorry, you're going to need Google Analytics. You're going to need 5 other things. If you have a large marketing team, you might need 15 other things. And so we saw this firsthand. We moved the builder.io site to Qwik and instantly found that we can make it fast, but then the third-party scripts can really crush your score. Like, I'm not saying a couple points. I'm talking like from 100 down to like 60 again. And that's just from a few scripts. So Partytown, we would talk about how we utilize web workers to solve for that. And then the last bucket, and I think it's important not to forget, is we're really acknowledging here that the way to have a fast site is to just shoot HTML from the CDN, right? Whether it's personalized HTML or static HTML, if I'm requesting a site, I just, blam, I need to be hit with very light optimized HTML without lots of JavaScript and other cruft. The reality, though, is most websites are constantly changing. New pages are made, rearranges, A/B tests, personalizations. You know, if we stick to an e-commerce example, you want your homepage to look different to people who shop menswear than women's wear, right? Let's show products that are applicable. Traditionally, people will use all sorts of weird hacks and injections from third-party scripts on this. But really, if we want to say, hey, Qwik and Partytown is the stack that lets us be insanely performant, we need a tool that can deliver, whether it's personalized content, A/B tested, or just dynamically generated from the marketing team needing to schedule all kinds of new pages or whatever in advance. All needs to be natively compatible with this. Oh, thank you for the feedback. Let me slow things down a bit. So for everybody who English is your second language, hopefully this will be more straightforward to follow. I'll pause here too, and let's check the question. So, oh, good question. Is there platforms like WhatsApp groups to get connected with our team for the future? So yes, Discord, maybe Misko or Adam can share in the chat a link to Discord. So you can jump in there where we talk about Builder, Qwik, and Partytown and be able to sort of ask follow-up questions. How do I get started? Stuff like that. But anyway, with all that ceremony, let's actually dive into the meat of things. So like we sort of identified, we don't want to do too much for a page to load, right? Ideally, we just want HTML. If you're needing to get HTML and then download tons of JavaScript and then parse and execute that JavaScript, which if you've used Babel or TypeScript, you know it takes a long time to parse JavaScript and manipulate it. And in this case, browsers are faster. It's written in C++ instead of JavaScript or TypeScript, but it definitely is still a non-trivial task for browsers to do. So there's still a lot of work to be done that we'd ideally really like to skip. And then executing all of that JavaScript, and that's not to forget, just running the JavaScript is not enough. We actually, like say with the React app, we need to deserialize all the state. We need to bind all the event listeners. We actually are combing over all the DOM nodes again and binding all references. It's quite a lot going on here. And so another good question in the chat, when do we expect a major stable release of Qwik? Misko's typing, I think you'll have the answer shortly, but we're really kind of gung-ho towards that. It should be pretty soon. But yeah, so this is the state we'd like to get to. Now the question is, how do you deliver pure HTML, but it actually is functional? It can have JavaScript, but it doesn't need so much to get started. And so that's where there's an interesting technique that Google has an internal framework called Wiz that powers like Google Search, Gmail, and a lot of other Google apps where performance is critical. But I mean, there's tons of dynamic functionality of Google Search, right? You'll search the weather and you get a weather widget. You search, music, you get information about the artist, browse the music. There's a lot there that in a traditional sort of Jamstack React app, would be quite a bit of bloat most likely to add to those pages. Now, what's interesting is they use an interesting technique that they've semi-open sourced. They have this thing called JS Actions that kind of exposes a bit of this to open source land. But the technique is quite straightforward. They've been using it for quite a number of years. It's literally just deliver HTML, and in the HTML, serialize what the events and the JavaScript needed for the events are. So we can send to the browser pretty much no JS. We'll get to how the JS sort of looks in a second, but we can encapsulate sort of what needs to load and when, and that can allow us to basically not have JavaScripts, all this stuff eager evaluated in the beginning. So what does it look like? Well, what you need is a bootloader. You need one little snippet of JavaScript. The real one is a little bit bigger with Qwik, but it's still extremely small. Oh yeah, that's a good piece of feedback too. We might be able to find some type of live transcription as well. I'll try and keep speaking at a normal rate, but yeah, transcription is a great idea. It just came up in the chat. But anyway, so how this works is you can see the code here. It's sort of a demo example, but the idea is we bind some top level event listeners. Like we're just going to globally observe clicks, mouse enter, anything that might have been used on the page. And when one of those events occurs, we can then look up the path to the JavaScript, import it, and then execute it. So in this case, the only JavaScript that's needed to start an application of any massive size is a tiny little bit of code. Everything else can only be loaded as needed. And that's where you can kind of see we start to approach the solution to less JavaScript. Let's have as little as humanly possible for the page to load. Good question that came into the chat. So is Builder using Qwik behind the scenes in production? So yes, our website is, other things that we use. And we also are about to provide a Qwik SDK. So the idea of the Builder platform is it integrates with whatever tech stack you use. If you use React, it'll integrate with that. You can drag and drop and build stuff with your React components as pieces. But what we'd like to see is people using Qwik, or at least those who care about performance, using Qwik and Builder with Qwik can get you a really next level performance. And we'll use it for things inside. We have a Qwik API to deliver content as HTML, as Qwik, stuff like that. And Amir asked, is this a code split in React terms? Yes, I think in the general sense of code splitting, precisely. It's definitely a different approach in some important ways. But the short answer is yes, this is effectively just code splitting. And it's code splitting in a way where nothing needs to eager load, yet everything can be serialized in advance. So a lot of how React is code splitting is if you want to split out the components, you may or may not be able to have the HTML on the page. In this case, HTML can be present and components could potentially never load in the browser. But anyway, now the one thing you might be asking from this example is what everybody asks, which is like, okay, if you're not loading any code until I click, won't there be a noticeable delay? So two things to know about that. Prefetching solves that, which we'll touch on in a second. And the second thing that's important to know about it is the way Qwik will shred your application. Any code that's loaded is very minimal. So you might be thinking of the React context where you're booting up a huge portion of a React tree at once. In Qwik, it's not only that you only load a component when needed, we actually split up the component into like micro pieces. So if this event listener, this on input, for that input below, is actually only needing a portion of the component, it's not touching children, it's not touching parents, it's not touching pieces within, it actually will only load the tiniest possible amount. So you could almost think of it like automated jQuery style coding. Like imagine if you just wrote, element dot first child dot, whatever value equals. That's a bit like the code that we will download. Now, the other thing you might ask is like, well, authoring this component, do I have to write all this stuff and make 1,000 JavaScript files? And the answer is no. Fortunately, Qwik components look very, very similar to React components. The clever trick here is using a fancy sort of, we call it an optimizer, a way to read the JSX and break it into multiple files. And so Qwik has a couple unique constraints. It's not pure React code, but you can write with the same mental model and the same type of code as a React component, composing many components. It should very much sort of feel the same. but it actually does all those optimizations under the hood. So it should be familiar, a good developer experience, those great benefits. We have a framework over it coming out soon called Qwik City, which if you have questions, Adam can go into detail on. But that's the one thing to know. And the next thing is prefetching, right? As opposed to your typical React app where you're loading virtually everything for a page and then executing everything. Well, with Qwik, we kind of flip it on its head. And by default, I mean, with a real Qwik app, this is not the actual default built in, but the nature of Qwik is to default to loading less, not more. And this allows us to explore different options here. It allows us to explore, well, maybe you want to prefetch only things that are visible, right? So in my little diagram, the hero of the page or the columns maybe will prefetch. They don't execute and they only pull a little bit of code, but the code is fetched in advance. So if you click on it, you get an immediate update to whatever the new state is. But we can also say, hey, maybe on desktop, we prefetch on hover, right? And so you don't do anything, even if it's visible, maybe your screen is large anyway. And when you hover over something, it'll do a quick prefetch. You can do eager prefetching. So you can just, we've done that before too on the builder site, which is just give me everything. I want it to be ready in memory. That's completely valid. Or we can do smart prioritization. Like currently Qwik will by default prioritize certain types of events that are more likely to be important than others. And we're exploring sort of the ideas of like using analytics, like what are the things people are mostly clicking on to then drive what is prefetched. So if most people hit this page and click, that big button in the middle, well, let's prefetch that. And if almost nobody is clicking the other elements surrounding it, let's not prefetch it until later, or maybe not at all. And so moving on to the last thing here, you might be like, okay, well, what about ecosystem, right? React has a million design systems and components for anything I need. The exciting part to us about this approach is purely the fact that this idea of serializing HTML and only resuming it when needed can kind of be backwards compatible with some of these frameworks. So we've actually made the sort of Quickify layer. I think the final imports announce difference, but the idea is you could wrap React components and have material UI or whatever actually used in your Qwik app. And in many cases, never hydrate in the client or selectively hydrate in the client. It's only going to hydrate when needed. So if you're like, hey, I've got this giant React app with 1,001 components, I can't migrate all of it. You don't need to. Just wrapping it with Qwik can give you an immediate performance benefit. And maybe migrating everything one day or the more heavily utilized areas one day can lead you to actually be able to have a very, very extremely performant app. So what we've seen is you really can achieve an extremely good performance score with this approach. 94 is almost like if you just slap it together, you're even with tons of advanced functionality in sight, it's a very common sort of result you can get. But you can get a lot faster. I have some more to talk about here, but I do know we'll have follow-up sessions. So I want to pause here. I actually dumped a lot of information. And so if anybody has questions on Qwik, this is actually a really good time to jump in with them, either in the chat or in the Q&A. Otherwise, I can breeze on to Partytown, but would love to sort of make sure we're answering everything that are top of mind for people. Do a quick awkward pause so people feel just uncomfortable enough to throw their questions in so we can answer them. And also, if you ask a question, it's a good time to actually have Misko answer, so I'm not droning on about his project, and he can tell you in his own words from the answer to your more in-depth questions. Otherwise, I'm happy to drone on about Partytown if that is the best thing. Let's do that. But if anybody has quick questions, we can have the man himself, Misko, answers. Keep jumping them in the chats. So as you've seen, we're really obsessed with this idea of it should not be performance versus functionality. You need both. And as we can see, and we've seen in real results, just migrating to Qwik can boost your performance. But with one gigantic caveat that we touched on, which is when you add all your third-party scripts, they will dock you really, really hard again. And this can be one of the most frustrating things to developers because like Lighthouse is going to suggest, oh, have less of this code, have better cache headers, all this stuff. And it's really frustrating because it's not your code. You don't control the cache headers for Google Analytics.js. You don't control the bloated amount of JavaScript that's being loaded for functionality you might not need. And you're probably not in a position to rewrite Google Analytics as a service, right? And you may have thought for a moment you're in a position to argue with your marketing team and say, hey, it's not worth it. But believe me, in every case I've seen, the business wins those arguments. They do need analytics. The website needs to understand usage patterns in order for the business to grow. And so that's where it comes back to. And I remember when we were exploring this, is like, well, we really just need to get all that third-party bloated code off of the main thread. How big is the Qwik team? That's a good question. It's really 3 people. Actually, let's get Misko to talk for one. So Misko, you want to take this, tell us about the Qwik team?
I was just about to type it up in the thing. I'll answer that later.
I can.
Yeah, you can type it up. So Qwik, the idea started back in 2019. I gave actually a talk on it. And then I kind of started toying with it last year. But none of this stuff would ever happen without some awesome people behind it. So the awesome people behind it are Adam Bradley, who is the creator of Ionic. Adam, you can probably say hi. You're muted.
Hello. Yes, I'm helping out this guy with Qwik, and are also the other big teammate.
And the other person is Manu. Manu is known for some pretty cool projects on Go. And together, the 3 of us, mainly those 2, and I'm the cheerleader, we're building this thing called Qwik. And we think it's going to revolutionize the way things are, because, while other frameworks kind of compete and try to win hearts and minds of developers on kind of developer experience, which is important, they're all fundamentally the same. And so what kind of puts Qwik apart is this unique approach where we are really focusing on not drowning the browser with all of the JavaScript. I can talk about this for hours, but I'm assuming you have a plan, Steve. So I don't want to just.
I 100% believe you could talk about it for hours. Yeah, and yeah, no, it's true. So the team is small, though. One thing we found is we get pretty good community contribution to these projects. We have Qwik, we have Partytown, we have another one called Mitosis. We can talk about, totally separate session. But yeah, it is a small team. I mean, it's a pretty mighty team who could actually blast out some pretty crazy stuff pretty quickly. But yeah, the community drives a lot of this too. Pull requests, issues, all that stuff. And Adam, I'd actually love if you want to jump in and talk about what you're working on for Qwik now, because you have a specific project I think people might find interesting.
Yeah, so from the beginning, we've been working on Qwik, and it's been, right, like Misko's saying, it's drastically different. And so that's kind of caused a lot of different tooling that we've had to work on. And so a lot of our last couple of months have been focused on getting Qwik to be usable and be able to be basically used by anyone else. And so then the next big step now is we kind of want to put a meta framework on top of that. So really think of Next.js or SvelteKit or Gatsby, something like that, where it's kind of that layer on top of the framework. That's kind of what Qwik is missing right now. And what I'm working on right now is called Qwik City. It's our play on words of basically providing that meta framework on top of all this to really simplify a lot of it. And so if you're familiar with Next.js or really any of these meta frameworks, you're going to be very, very comfortable with kind of the same look and feel, using nested layouts, using file-based routing, things like that. So it's going to allow you to build either a multi-page application or a single-page application, all with the same code. So I'm hoping to wrap it up very shortly here. We're probably going to have a session one of these days to show it off to see where we're at. Right now, the doc site is built with an older version of Qwik City. So once we get the doc site updated with the newer version of it, then we'll really start to show it off and try to get some more people checking it out, giving us some feedback.
That's awesome. And then one question that came in, Adam, what is Qwik City really for?
What's it really for?
Yeah, I think the question is, maybe I can give a first pass on the answer. So Qwik in itself is a lot like React. It's just a way to make components, and with the addition of loading them in a very unique way, that really helps with the performance of your website. So why do you need Qwik City? Well, Qwik, just like React, has no built-in system for like creating files for the routes. Like think of everything Next.js does. Qwik is like React, and Qwik City is like Next.js. Is that helpful? Is there anything you'd like to add to that, Adam?
Yeah, and yeah, right. Qwik City is not necessary, right? Just like a framework isn't necessary. You can do document create element and do all this stuff yourself and write all the code. We can even use, I'm going to say, write some binary code, and we can do that too to build websites. But the point is kind of that abstraction on top of things to really simplify it. And I think, yeah, the best comparison is Qwik is React and Qwik City is Next.js.
We're also exploring, and like, for example, we're big friends with the Next.js team. We think they're phenomenal. So one of our goals is not to compete, it's to sort of augment. So we're exploring other ways on how you can use the two together. It's definitely tricky given the Qwik sort of, to get the benefits of Qwik, there's a very unique way that you need to be loading, which is very different than React's, Svelte's, name everything that came before it. but yeah, it's an interesting sort of situation, and it's something we're kind of always exploring. Misko, what would you say is the thing you're most excited about Qwik, both now and coming up in the future?
The integration with React. Am I unmuted? Yes, I am.
Yes.
The integration with React, I mean, the Qwikify, I think that's a huge thing because, asking the world to come into a brand new way of building stuff is a very tall order. I know that Qwik has some amazing promises that it's making, and I think we can deliver on them. But the path would be so much simpler if you have a transition story, right? And so the thing that Qwikify allows is to take React components and bringing them into the Qwik application, or take existing React application and start at the root and slowly convert them one component at a time into Qwik. And as you convert more and more of these components, you get more of the benefits of Qwik.
Yeah, I honestly think it's huge.
The other thing I'm excited about is I really think, just like there was a transition from, the back in the jQuery days, which were like pre-component way of building sites, to AngularJS kind of popularized the component building sites, and there's an explosion of frameworks that are kind of falling into the component world. I think the same way that transition was happening, and it was a kind of a complete mental shift into how applications are built, and the world hasn't been the same since then. I think Qwik is a similar kind of a mental shift. I think we're going to see a complete change in how we treat browser and how we deliver stuff to the browser. And whether Qwik or not is going to succeed, I'm certainly hope that's going to succeed. There will be other frameworks in this new world which will focus on this thing. Now, obviously, since we have the first mover advantage, I am pretty hopeful that it's going to be us. But I would expect that, in a few years, there's going to be a lot of copycat frameworks that are going to say, they're going to look at this mental model and say, yes, it is not possible to ship all this JavaScript upfront. This is just ridiculous. We need to have a system by which the browser, I always say, can sip on the JavaScript rather than, get a deluge of JavaScript at the very beginning.
Yeah, and to kind of follow up on that a little bit, I think the other difference is that these frameworks, AngularJS, React, all of them kind of started as a single page application JavaScript. And then as time went on, it's like, well, we should actually start to put routing inside of this. We should be able to, and we can run it inside of Node.js. And we can also have it do server-side rendering. So server-side rendering was kind of the last thing that was added to a lot of these frameworks. Whereas here, Qwik has kind of it's thought of this from the very, very beginning in the serialization, and like how Misko always says, it's resumable application. So the server side is able to, takes a snapshot of where the state of that application is at. Your browser downloads that state, and then it continues from that point forward. And so that's the big mental shift I think is happening right now.
So we have a couple on the YouTube live. We've got a couple questions. So we'll get to that in 1 second. But I'm actually curious, Misko, Adam, does it ever feel like we're going backwards in time, but in a good way? Like we're going back to like a Ruby on Rails mindset, but if we just thought about it differently, like if we did it cleaner and made things load smarter, but it's really that server-side first mentality in a certain way?
Yeah, I have answers, but I want to see if Adam wants to jump in first.
No, what's funny is, so I've been working on Qwik City and the file-based routing and how that stuff works. I've actually spent a lot of time on even the Jekyll docs of how it works and how, Markdown, and it does all the front matter parsing and really the file-based routing. So in a way, yes, it's just that we've always had to have two worlds. We're like, well, there's a server-side world. It's written in Django, it's written in PHP, and now we want it to be interactive. So let's use jQuery or web components or something like that. And so it's always been two different worlds. And so what we're trying to do here is kind of like, you're writing it once, like truly write once, run everywhere type of thing. So I want to write this component. It's going to run great inside of Node.js or inside of Dino, and then transfer that state over to the browser where the same code that you wrote can continue to work. And so that's all part of what the optimizer does, is how it's able to split it out and run on the two different worlds, but with the same code base.
Can I add something to it? I think,
yes.
I like to think of it a little bit that we're taking the best of jQuery and leaving the worst of jQuery behind. The thing that, jQuery had a lot of horrible things, and I'm not saying we should go back to the days of jQuery, but the thing that jQuery got right is that if you had a huge page that was static and only a menu needed to be interactive, you just downloaded necessary code to make the menu interactive and nothing else, right? You download the amount of code you downloaded was proportional to the interactivity of the website, not to the complexity of the website. And we transitioned to the component model, and the component model is way nicer, way cleaner. That is definitely the way to go. But we have this problem that the amount of code we download is to the complexity of the site rather than to the interactivity of the site. And so what Qwik does is it's basically going back to this world of like, we only download the code for interactivity, but we have the beautiful development environment of components. So you get the best of both worlds, right? You get the wonderful development environment, the clean code and the proper way of architecting and designing, but you also get the benefit that you don't have to download all the code, only the code that's needed.
Yeah, it's so funny. Some people have called us the new jQuery. And I think that confuses the heck out of people because they're like, I don't want to go back to the world. It's like, no. Imagine you've got the DX of like a component system like React, but you actually had the runtime of somebody almost like hand coded all these pages to just have the littlest bit of the DOM manipulation needed that actually sort of runs. It's potentially worth also adding here too, something that's kind of really interesting, which is, you can also look at this as, what if you made like a Ruby on Rails of the future that not only acknowledges, minimal JavaScript, but full functionality, but also, I think, Adam, you brought up really briefly, the edge, you brought up specifically Dino, right? Like there are these new JavaScript runtimes that initialize wildly faster. They're actually simpler and more elegant in a lot of ways. And that's another thing maybe worth touching on is that we're very much leaning into that there's a plethora of environments you're going to need to run websites and apps. It may need to run client-side for certain cases. Great. It may need to run statically. You pre-generate and push to the edge or push to a file storage in the CDN caches, or it may need to be served dynamically from the edge. In fact, Adam or Misko, either of you take, but I think there's been some interesting developments on how Qwik can render on the edge extremely quickly. If either of you want to kind of explain what's been done there.
Adam, you want to jump in?
Yeah, a lot of the work has been making sure that Qwik itself and what it generates is just JavaScript. It's not, like coded to Node.js and having require statements and CommonJS. We're luckily kind of in this new era where everything is standardized with ES modules. And the edge runs off ES modules. We can generate completely Node.js free code, which is great for the edge. And so which means that we basically build this tiny little JavaScript file that we throw up into somewhere out in the world. And so the response times and boot up times are extremely fast and not coded to just Node.js, which means it's going to work great inside of Dino or whatever the next thing is.
Yeah, and I'll add one more thing is, while this looks like JSX, it does not always run like typical JSX. In fact, we're exploring compilation outputs, which for full credit is 100% inspired by SolidJS. If you don't follow Ryan Carniato and the SolidJS team, absolutely killer, doing incredible work in research on performance. And we definitely collaborate with the team like crazy to share ideas. Some of the Qwik resumability is being worked into Marco, I think Marco 6. A lot of SolidJS's smart compilation of transforming JSX in unique ways is working into sort of Qwik and sort of upcoming versions. Adam, please take over.
Before I forgot, you reminded me of like, so as far as rendering performance, things like that, that's kind of the current state of kind of what Misko is talking about with right now. For the last 10 years, everyone's been arguing about who's got the fastest render. And that's certainly a good thing to go down and chase after to have the fastest render. But with Qwik, the big thing that we're doing is basically, well, the fastest render is not rendering at all. And so if you think of a large web page that has a whole huge DOM tree that needs to render to build that page, that's why we care about performance of rendering, because you need to render that entire tree. But with Qwik, we understand that a majority of this stuff, a majority of those elements, maybe even all of those elements can't re-render, or there's no way they're able to re-render, or there's no listener that's able to change a certain div. When we understand at every single level of what stuff can't re-render, then that basically means that like, we don't have to re-render. We don't have to concern ourselves with rendering at all. And so as the old adage goes, the fastest database call is the one you don't have to make. It's kind of the same thing as the fastest render is the one that you don't have to render at all. And so I think that's also, to Misko's point of like how Qwik is different is that we're able to understand these things and basically skip rendering entirely.
Yeah, exactly. I love the example of the fastest website I know of is just example.com. Wow, it's fast. Google PageSpeed Insights, 100 out of 100. the lack of code is always the fastest code. So how do we bake it so you don't need to run code if it's not necessary? A couple good questions on the sort of YouTube live chat. So one is, first one, does Qwik serialize app state as you interact with it? Mishka, you want to take that?
Yeah, no, so that would be kind of expensive to always write to the DOM. So Qwik keeps track of the application state, but it keeps it in memory. And there's a special command you issue to Qwik that says pause. And it's only when you pause the application does it actually serialize into HTML. And that's when you can move the application to a different VM, essentially.
Yeah, Mishka is a really cool demo where you interact with an application to do e-commerce, whatever, and then you hit the command, freeze dry it, so everything's serialized again, and you paste it in a new browser tab and then resume it, and you just keep going off from the state. It is wild. I think in one of our upcoming sessions, we can do the full deep dive on Qwik with all the cool demos. Mishka's done some cool conferences lately, some cool trainings. And so while this is quite a high level overview, and I think, given time, we'll probably just hit on Qwik, though we'll see if we have time to squeeze in some Partytown. There's some cool stuff to show there, and Builder as well. We can go in more depth in future examples, in future sessions too, which we hope to make this a very recurring thing. I'm certainly enjoying it. So next question, this is a very good one. I could take a stab at and let anybody jump in with more, is why would someone use Svelte with Qwik? Which functionality would Svelte provide that Qwik does not have? So the short answer is, when we're thinking about compatibility with other frameworks, we're maybe acknowledging two things. Thing one is you probably already have a lot of code in other frameworks that you don't want to have to rebuild. It's tedious, it's painstaking. And a lot of this is very much inspired by Astro. So Astro is another awesome framework to check out of like, hey, what if we can just import those things and make it so that we don't have to overly load that JavaScript if it's not needed. So for the Svelte, like, why would you use Svelte within Qwik? Reason one would be you're a large company, you have tons of Svelte components. You want to optimize how the components render and have less JavaScript on load, yet you don't want to rewrite everything. Regarding the second piece of the question, what functionality would Svelte provide that Qwik does not have? I can give you one example. It'll take time for Qwik to build up an ecosystem. So maybe there's just a really cool library you like in Svelte and you just love to use it in Qwik without a sort of rebuild of the entire library. That maybe be one example. There's not any innate functionality. Actually, I think Svelte has pretty first-class support for animations. So that's something to be layered in to Qwik with time and ways that the third party, like the community, can layer in abstractions for it too. But yeah, there's nothing I wouldn't say there's any smoking gun of a Svelte feature that Qwik does not have. But there might be some people just love Svelte, right? It might be nice to actually be able to use those components, use libraries within Qwik. Anything else, either Adam or Mishka, you want to add on that, or should we jump into the next question about routing? Because that's a good topic worth talking about, actually. Maybe we'll do that. Mishka, I see you typing, but actually I'd love to I think routing is something that there could be a variety of approaches that actually make a lot of sense, whether it's server-side, whether it's HTML, whether it's kind of client-side single page. So I'll shut up and actually, Mishka or Adam, please give your thoughts on routing with Qwik. I mean, there is routing you can use, but there's ways in the future that this could get more interesting too.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump into this. I have this crazy vision. Sorry, I made a short response in the text format. I'll give you a longer response here. So there is basically two routing strategies, right? You can have the router on a server, and we call that the multi-page application, or you can have the router on the client in the browser, and we call that the server a single-page application, or MPA versus SPA. Currently, we are kind of focusing with Qwik on MPA because we think that there's just more use cases and more of our customers get to use that. But there is nothing that actually prevents us from having an SPA solution as well. And it's probably something that's going to come down the line after we finish our current roadmap. The crazy thought I have in my head, and that I always tell people, is I would like to have a hybrid model. One where you start with the application in the MPA mode because that's faster for startup. And then one that kind of transitions seamlessly into the SPA mode. And the seamless transition, I think, is something that really only Qwik can do, because only Qwik has this idea of being able to pause, resume, and compose what we call containers on the page. And so this is still an area of active development, but the direction we're heading is to have these transitional applications that start as MPA and end their life as SPAs. Adam, do you want to add something to it?
No, I'd say with the next version of Qwik, it really is trying to solve this problem. So again, Qwik, or React itself doesn't solve routing. So that there's React router, the Next.js provides its own router, Gatsby has its own router. So it's kind of the same thing there, is where Qwik itself isn't concerned about that. But then Qwik City provides its take on what's the best way to do routing. So the current doc site basically has a little manual router that says if you're at this path, then render this component this route. So it can be as simple as that. And then with our file-based routing, very inspired by Next.js and SvelteKit, it does all this for you. So it just depends on the folder structure and the name of the files that it is able to build that router. And that same router is able to work on the server. So it's able to do what Misko says, where it basically renders that state of that page at the moment, and pauses it for that moment. And then on the client sides get picked up. So we would not be that far off at all to also then have the client side routing and be able to pick up from there, because the router is going to work on the client side just as well too. And so we'd be able to, have kind of the best of both worlds, I think. And at the same time, because of the nature of Qwik, we're able to not download quite a bit of code, because we know a majority of that page actually isn't able to change.
Yeah, it's worth adding too some additional inspiration we take. Remix was a good inspiration. They do some really great stuff on the sort of nested layouts and routing. So that drove some inspiration. And, I was running some tests on my side too. It's pretty crazy because of Qwik's different sort of unique primitives. You get all these different options for how you want to add, load code, right? Do you want to load it with JavaScript? Do you want to load it with full page HTML, fragments of HTML? One thing, and just playing around with how Builder sort of outputs Qwik for content, where you use the two together, is this idea. It was really crazy. We'll get this live at a certain point, but if you sort of on interaction, say you're clicking between tabs and the next tab just needs to load its tab contents, or let's take something slightly larger, like a full page transition between the header and the footer. If all you're doing is doing an inner HTML swap, which Qwik is capable of, given its sort of nature of being HTML first, it's ridiculous how fast that is. In fact, the only cost you pay is the browser parsing the HTML, which can take a few milliseconds. But it's like, we have these two tabs on the Builder homepage, like for developers and for business users, and I could just tap through those at lightning pace. It was insane. And that's just having two pieces of HTML in memory and just inner HTML swapping, and makes this instant. Like, what's cool about Qwik to me is not just that first page load is fast, but everything after that is just ridiculously fast. Like, it's awesome. And you can be so smart about what you prefetch and how you load. And I started messing around with, maybe we'll get back to a certain point, pre-parsing the HTML, meaning if you do just an inner HTML swap, the browser has to do a quick parse and load. But if you actually render, if you construct a document fragment first, and then you just do a DOM node replace, you get like literally 1 millisecond transitions that are as complex as you can imagine. So you could just be like tapping through an application and just like, no joke, millisecond, like a millisecond to get to the next state. Really, this sounds great, but when you feel it, it's just like, wow, it's insane. Like an instant transitioning application, instant loading and instant loading next state is crazy. Mishko, what do you think about micro-frontends? That's a hot term that keeps coming up, and we've kind of had some thoughts on it if you want to share.
Yeah. I love talking about that. So the micro-frontends, where they become a thing is that when you have a large team, basically there's too many people for a single application, and they essentially just clobber each other. And so what you want to do is you want to break up the application into smaller teams, and each team works on it. Now, the problem is, if you do that, how do you then reassemble it back into a real applications? And so there have been a whole bunch of work in this area, but most of the tooling kind of has all kinds of limitations. The interesting thing about Qwik is that because it's all about HTML and HTML first, the applications can assemble themselves in the browser. You don't need like a build tool or anything of that sort to kind of put it together. And we actually take advantage of this already. Like on the Qwik homepage, the menu bar at the top is basically one Qwik application that is running one version of Qwik. And then the content that's actually rendered in the center is actually coming from Builder, and Builder has a different version of Qwik and different code that's being shipped over there. And the two applications just seamlessly coincide, and the user has no idea that they're actually visiting a site with two different applications. So Qwik can do that, and that's kind of an interesting trick that other frameworks can't really do that, because most other frameworks really want to be like one cohesive unit. And the fact that they're the cohesive unit creates problems when you want to deliver the applications from different URLs, different build, or if you want to roll back an application or roll back a feature or things of that sort. So I'm actually very excited. I've been actually chatting with a lot of people in the conferences about micro frontends, and everybody who I kind of show this or talk to about actually is very excited because they immediately see that it actually properly solves the issues that the micro frontend community is trying to resolve.
Yeah, I think it's wild personally. It's interesting too when Qwik can do the orchestration of loading, because one of the things people, I mean, ideally, like you said, people want multiple independent applications loaded in the browser, and they might not, like we were talking to a very large company who's internally, they use Angular and React, and they're exploring other options. And the question is like, if you're amalgamating, say, micro frontends, a Svelte and a React and something else in one, normally that'll crush your performance. But the way Qwik can actually can work with all those frameworks ultimately and keep them from hydrating can actually give you this really beautiful transition path, which is kind of really exciting. One other comment that came up here, which I think is fascinating, is the dream of browsers one day supporting these types of paradigms natively. I will say we get the majority of that feedback around Partytown, like this idea, like, can we have a script execution environment that is off the main thread, but can tap the main thread in a synchronous way as needed? I think it's very clear that we'll run out of time shortly, so we'll definitely go way deeper on Partytown in next session. But that's one that, we are seeing, we do have a good relationship with, and Misko and Adam that certainly had influence on browser standards in the past too, the way frameworks need things, et cetera. But we do have good relationships with those who are setting the standards like W3C, Chrome team, stuff like that. And we definitely want to see as much of this be standardized as possible. So for like Misko's point, the cost of the Qwik bootloader is very trivial. And truly the Partytown loader is as well. But the more the stuff is truly native and built in, the more it always gets faster. I think the task for us and the group here attending can help is we need adoption of these patterns. These things get standardized in the browser when it becomes clear in the ecosystem that people need a standard solution because they're adopting a third-party approach that is just such proven in terms of how it works and the need for it and the value of it that the teams working on these browsers can actually jump in and prioritize that work. So that's an exciting area that we'll see unfold over time. And I have one last question. I think this would be an interesting one for Misko as well. Again, we'll pick up on the Partytown and Builder and how you can combine them all to have a pretty amazing sort of web building experience that really truly satisfies the requirements of a real business without saying, other parts are your problem. But I have one other thing too. Misko, what do you think about personalization? We talk about the edge and we talk about pre-rendering, but like, sure, we want to have these lightning fast instant loading pages, but we want to have a different username and avatar in the corner of each, page, stuff like that. What do you think about that?
Yeah, that's actually interesting. When we had when we had jQuery, it was easy to personalize because generating HTML on a server was fast, and jQuery kind of attached behavior, but it kind of respected the HTML that was there. So if you rendered a particular username, then jQuery would kind of respect that, and you would just go with it. This actually became difficult with latest technology because executing an application on a server is just expensive. And because of that, most people can't afford it. And so they simply serve static content from the CDN. And the thing that's difficult is to mix and match and basically say, like, look, you have a whole application. Maybe the whole application doesn't have to be SSR'd. Could I just SSR a portion? And that's usually something that can't really be done in the existing system. But with Qwik, because Qwik is has this idea of micro frontends and this idea of containers, what you can do is you can easily pre-render individual containers and concatenate them together and produce a unique experience by swapping large sections of the page onto the screen. And for something like a username, which clearly has to be fully rendered, well, there you have to run a full rendering pipeline. But because it's just a teeny tiny portion of the overall screen, it's actually computationally feasible to do at the edge. Whereas something like rendering the whole page that's fully customizable really computationally is not feasible to do at the edge. So I think personalization is another area where Qwik can be super unique because it will be able to do things that other frameworks simply can't because they can't compose in the way that Qwik can compose.
Yeah, it's super wild. I mean, the number one thing we're finding is with this paradigm shift, with this completely different mental model, it's crazy. I think we'll be exploring for years all the amazing sort of benefits and trade-offs. I mean, there's been wacky ideas as well. Like with Qwik, given that it can serialize the incremental state of the application to the DOM, we could always explore something like a debug mode, where as you use the application, it is kind of, per that question, forcing the serialization. So a slightly less performant mode for debugging, but then you could just time travel. You could just rip back and forward in time to reproduce issues, inspect the state, stuff like that. There's a lot here that I think we'll be unpacking over time, but we are running out of time for this session today. I think we have a lot of interesting topics to follow up on. And so if anybody has last minute questions, it is a good chance to just rock it in and we can rip out a quick answer. But as you probably already know too, I probably should have this in a way that I could pull up on here. In fact, I can just do it here. But if you want to know about future sessions, we're trying to turn this into a cadence. I would definitely say this was a very sort of fun experience on my side, and I hope those who joined got value out of it. And so we'd really love to make this recurring. You could follow us on social media. Builder.io is the Builder account. Obviously, that's where we all work. You could follow Misko, Adam. Oh, you have your middle initial in here, right? Adam something Bradley.
D
Bradley, and there's an EY. Did I get that right?
Yep, LEY.
Cool. Steve 8708. If you follow any of these, they get that right, you'll hear about sort of upcoming stuff. We hope to do a lot more. We'll try and explore more ways to sort of get polls and questions in advance so we can answer the burning questions. But we'll follow up with an upcoming session. I think we can go much deeper on Partytown because we didn't hit it, and it's a pretty wild and awesome solution. And we'll touch on the Builder platform, and we'll touch on a whole much more depth on Qwik and sort of what exists, what's coming, how it works, why it's interesting. But for now, I just want to thank every single buddy for joining. This was sort of our kind of canary test of doing a stream in this format. Really, really enjoyed it. I loved getting the questions. This is helpful for us to know what to focus on with our work too. Like, what are people asking about? That's something that maybe we need to make sure we have good answers built into the framework, not just good answers spoken verbally. And I'll sign off in a minute, but Adam, Misko, if you want to say a parting word or just a thanks and goodbye, give you a chance to do that first.
I just say, like, I always love talking about this. This is something that I'm super, super passionate about. And I love the people I work with. They're just more awesome at it than I am. So this was a lot of fun.
Yeah, I just want to have a plug for hit us up on Discord. We certainly would love to hear how you're using Qwik, any issues that you have, and you can do some collaboration there.
Yes, I think Discord link is in the chat, so that we are always active on that. Ping us your questions, open issues, try it out, and get excited for the Qwik City release. It's coming very soon. I think we're basically right around the corner of full stable beta, ready to go Qwik, and Qwik City is right around that corner too. So stay tuned. Thank you everybody for joining, and we'll see you next time.